Whispers followed Charlene Stewart like a foul stench through the muddy streets of Bitter Creek. Tossed aside by her husband for her empty womb, she was branded entirely useless by polite society. Everything changed when a rugged mountain man, trailing 5 motherless children, walked into the mercantile and pointed a calloused finger directly at her. Snowmelt turned the main thoroughfare of Bitter Creek, Wyoming, into a treacherous river of brown sludge in the early spring of 1883, but the physical chill was nothing compared to the frostbite of social exile. Charlene Stewart sat by the fogged window of her cramped, drafty boarding house room, a needle flying through the heavy denim of a miner's trousers. At 28, she possessed a quiet, understated beauty. Soft auburn hair, pinned meticulously at the nape of her neck, and eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic horizon. Yet, in the eyes of the town, she was entirely invisible. Or worse, a cautionary tale. 3 years had passed since Nathaniel Reed, a prominent local banker and her husband of 7 years, had stood before the town magistrate and successfully petitioned for an annulment. The grounds were painfully public and utterly humiliating. Charlene was barren. Month after month, year after year, the cradle remained empty. Nathaniel, a man obsessed with legacy and bloodlines, had grown increasingly bitter, his whispered disappointments turning into shouting matches, and finally, a cold, calculated dismissal. A woman who cannot bear fruit is like a well dried up in the desert, Nathaniel had cruelly announced during a Sunday dinner within earshot of the town gossips. What use is she to a man? The divorce left Charlene with nothing but her maiden name, a modest sewing kit, and a brand of shame that burned hotter than a branding iron. Bitter Creek was a burgeoning boomtown, harsh and unforgiving, where survival depended on community ties. For a discarded woman, those ties were severed completely. The righteous women of the parish, led by the perpetually scowling Martha Higgins, crossed the muddy streets to avoid her. They believed a barren woman was cursed by the Almighty, a bad omen for their own growing families. To survive, Charlene took in mending from the saloon girls and the silver miners, the only people who didn't care about the state of her womb, so long as their seams held. She lived a life of profound isolation, wrapped in a suffocating cloak of silence. Her only companions were the stray dogs she fed with scraps from her meager supper, and the haunting, hollow ache in her chest. She had so much love to give, a maternal instinct so fierce it sometimes brought her to her knees in the middle of the night, weeping into her solitary pillow. On a particularly biting Tuesday afternoon, Charlene ventured out to the general store to purchase a spool of heavy thread and a small sack of flour. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully, a sharp contrast to the sudden, heavy silence that descended upon the patrons inside. Martha Higgins paused mid-sentence, her eyes darting over Charlene's faded woolen shawl. Adding salt to the perpetual wound, Nathaniel Reed stood near the Cracker Barrel. On his arm was his new bride, Bethany, barely 19, radiant and undeniably heavy with child. The swell of Bethany's belly was a beacon of Nathaniel's virility and Charlene's supposed failure. Nathaniel offered Charlene a condescending tip of his bowler hat. "Miss Stewart, keeping busy with the needle, I see. A fitting solitary pursuit." Charlene kept her chin high, though her hands trembled as she handed her coins to the clerk. "Good afternoon, Mr. Reed. I find honest work keeps the mind sharp." Bethany giggled, a high, piercing sound. "Oh, Nathaniel, don't tease the poor thing. It must be so dreadfully lonely in that little room of hers, with no little feet to patter about." The cruelty was casual, designed to assert dominance. Charlene felt the familiar burn of tears but forced them down, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her sorrow. She gathered her small parcels, preparing to retreat to her quiet purgatory. But before she could reach the door, the wooden floorboards rattled under a heavy, booted tread. The light from the doorway was entirely eclipsed by a mountain of a man. John Jeb Russell was a myth whispered about over whiskey glasses in the local saloon. He lived high up on Wolverine Ridge, a treacherous, unforgiving peak that loomed over Bitter Creek like a sleeping beast. Men said he wrestled grizzly bears for sport and spoke only to the wind. He was clad in a thick coat of bear fur, his broad shoulders easily brushing the doorframe as he entered. A ragged, dark beard concealed half his face, but his eyes, piercing, hawk-like, and startlingly blue, swept the room with an air of absolute authority. But it was not the formidable presence of the mountain man that left the townspeople speechless. It was the ragged parade trailing behind him. 5 children, stepping like feral wolves, filed into the mercantile. The oldest, a boy of about 12 with a hardened jaw and defensive posture, held the hand of a 10-year-old girl wrapped in a man's oversized coat. Behind them clung an 8-year-old boy, and a tiny 5-year-old girl shivering in thin boots. In Jeb's massive arms, bundled in a worn blanket, was a toddler, his face streaked with soot and dried tears. The children looked exhausted, half-starved, and wild. Martha Higgins gasped, clutching her chest. Lord Almighty, the savage brought his cubs to town. Jeb ignored the murmurs. He stepped to the counter, slamming down a heavy pouch of gold dust that made the clerk jump. Supplies. Jeb's voice was like grinding stones, deep and resonant. Flour, sugar, salt, oats, blankets, and boots. For all of them, as the flustered clerk began scrambling to fill the order, the youngest child, a toddler named Matthew, wriggled out of Jeb's arm. The boy dropped to the floor, his little legs unsteady, and waddled directly toward a display of glass lanterns. Before anyone could react, the toddler tripped over a loose floorboard. He went down hard, his knee striking a nailhead. A sharp, piercing wail erupted from the child, shattering the tense silence. The townswomen stepped back in unison, as if the crying child carried a plague. Jeb turned, his massive frame tight with panic. He was a man who could fell a pine tree with an axe, but faced with a weeping 2-year-old, he looked entirely out of his depth. Charlene didn't think. Her body moved on sheer, unadulterated instinct. Dropping her flour sack, she rushed forward and dropped to her knees in the dust of the mercantile floor. Shh, shh, sweet boy, Charlene murmured, her voice a soft, melodic contrast to the harshness of the room. She scooped the sobbing toddler into her arms, ignoring the dirt that immediately smeared against her clean dress. She inspected the scraped knee, quickly pulling a clean white cotton handkerchief from her pocket. It's all right, brave one, she cooed, applying gentle pressure to the scrape. Just a little scratch. You're a tough mountain boy, aren't you? Matthew's wails reduced to wet sniffles. He looked up at Charlene with wide, tear-filled eyes, then miraculously laid his dirty cheek against her shoulder, burying his face in the warmth of her neck. Jeb Russell stood frozen, watching the exchange. For 3 years since his wife had died of the winter fever, he had watched his children grow feral and distant. He had given them shelter, food, and survival, but he had not been able to give them softness. Seeing this ostracized woman holding his son with such natural, effortless grace struck him like a physical blow. Nathaniel Reed scoffed, stepping forward. Careful, Russell. That's Charlene Stewart. She's a dried-up husk. Couldn't bear a child of her own, so I suppose she has to play pretend with your dirty cast-offs. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jeb turned his imposing gaze slowly toward Nathaniel. The mountain man closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, towering over the banker. You speak of this woman like she ain't worth the dirt on my boots, Jeb growled, his voice vibrating in the quiet room. But she's the only one in this miserable town who didn't look at my boy like he was a stray dog. Jeb turned back to Charlene. She was still kneeling, cradling Matthew, looking up at him with a mixture of fear and defiance. Jeb saw the deep sorrow in her eyes, a reflection of the crushing loneliness he felt on the mountain. Miss Stewart, Jeb said, his tone softening surprisingly as he addressed her. They tell me you ain't got no family, no attachments. Charlene swallowed hard, her grip on the toddler tightening slightly. That is correct, Mr. Russell. I don't need a woman to give me babies, Jeb said loudly, his voice echoing off the tin roof, ensuring every gossip in the room heard him clearly. I got 5 of them already. What I need is a mother for them, a partner to help me run my homestead. I ain't offering romance, and I ain't offering an easy life. But I promise you a fire, a roof, and a family that won't throw you away. The mercantile was so silent, one could hear the snow melting outside. Nathaniel's jaw hung open in shock. Jeb extended a massive, scarred hand toward Charlene. "Will you marry me, Miss Stewart, and come up the mountain?" Charlene looked from Jeb's extended hand to the faces of the children watching her. The oldest boy, Samuel, glared with a fierce, protective anger, but the little girl, Lucy, looked at her with desperate, hungry hope. She looked at Nathaniel, whose face was purple with indignation. For years, she had been told she was less than a woman because she couldn't create life. But looking at these 5 motherless souls, Charlene realized that giving birth was only a fraction of what it meant to be a mother. She took a deep breath, placed her small, pale hand into Jeb's rough, leather-like palm, and stood up, still holding the toddler. "Yes, Mr. Russell," Charlene said clearly, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "I will." The wedding was finalized an hour later by a bewildered circuit judge. There were no flowers, no white lace, and no celebratory toasts. Charlene's dowry consisted of her sewing machine and a trunk of meager belongings. By mid-afternoon, they were loaded into a heavy, reinforced Conestoga wagon, beginning the grueling ascent up Wolverine Ridge. The journey was a brutal introduction to her new reality. The wagon rattled over jagged rocks and deep ruts carved by spring runoff. The air grew noticeably thinner and bitterly cold the higher they climbed. Inside the wagon bed, Charlene sat surrounded by sacks of grain and the 5 children, who regarded her with a mixture of suspicion and silent hostility. Samuel, the 12-year-old, was the ringleader of their resistance. He sat with his arms crossed, his dark eyes so like his father's burning holes into Charlene's woolen coat. "You ain't our ma," Samuel spat out when Jeb halted the team of mules to clear a fallen branch from the trail. "Don't think you can just come up here and start ordering us around. We don't need you." Charlene met his angry gaze without flinching. "I have no intention of replacing your mother, Samuel. I am here to help your father, and to make sure your sister doesn't freeze in that thin coat." Speaking of which, she reached into her carpet bag and pulled out a thick, knitted wool scarf she had intended to sell in town. She leaned forward and wrapped it gently around little Lucy's neck. The girl stiffened at first, but as the warmth seeped in, she relaxed, burying her chin into the soft wool. "I am not your mother," Charlene reiterated calmly, looking back at Samuel. "But I am your ally, if you will let me be." Samuel scoffed and looked away, but the younger children watched Charlene with a shift in their demeanor. Thomas, the 8-year-old, inched a little closer to her side of the wagon. As twilight descended, casting long, eerie purple shadows across the jagged pine trees, the weather turned violently. A late-season squall swept down from the summit, bringing blinding sleet and howling winds that rocked the heavy wagon. Jeb yelled at the mules, his voice barely audible over the gale. Suddenly, a sickening crack echoed through the storm. The wagon lurched violently to the left. Charlene grabbed Matthew as the entire carriage pitched at a terrifying 45-degree angle. The children screamed, "Hold on!" Jeb roared, leaping from the driver's bench into the freezing mud. Charlene peeked through the canvas opening. The left rear wheel had slid off the slick rock of the trail and was dangling precariously over a steep, rocky ravine. The mules were whinnying in panic, struggling to keep their footing. If the wagon slipped another few inches, it would drag the mules and all of them down into the abyss. "Samuel, get the younger ones out the front," Jeb yelled, throwing his massive shoulder against the listing back corner of the wagon, straining to keep it from sliding further. His boots slipped in the mud. "Now, boy, move." Samuel froze, paralyzed by the sheer drop beside them and the roaring wind. "Samuel, look at me," Charlene commanded, her voice slicing through the chaos. The boy's panicked eyes snapped to hers. "You can do this. Take Lucy. Thomas, follow him. Go over the bench and jump clear to the right side of the trail. Go." Snapping out of his terror, Samuel grabbed his sister and scrambled over the front bench, tossing her safely onto the muddy bank. Thomas followed. Charlene pushed the 10-year-old Abigail out next. The wagon groaned, slipping another inch. Jeb let out a guttural yell of exertion, his face red, veins bulging in his neck as he fought gravity itself. Charlene held little Matthew tightly against her chest. She had to jump, but the angle was steep. "Charlene, throw him!" Jeb yelled from the back, his boots losing purchase. "I can't hold it much longer." Charlene moved to the front bench. Samuel stood on the safe bank, holding his arms out. "Toss him to me," Samuel yelled. Charlene trusted the boy. She swung Matthew and tossed the toddler over the perilous gap. Samuel caught him heavily, tumbling backward into the mud, but keeping the boy safe. Charlene prepared to jump herself, but her skirt caught violently on a splintered floorboard. The wagon shifted again, sliding ominously. "Charlene," Jeb bellowed. Abandoning modesty, Charlene grabbed the thick denim fabric of her skirt and tore it upward with all her might, ripping it free. She leaped from the bench just as the wooden axle gave way completely. With a thunderous crash, the back half of the wagon slammed down onto the rocky ledge, miraculously catching on a thick, jutting boulder that stopped it from tumbling over the edge. Charlene landed hard on her hands and knees in the freezing mud, gasping for breath. The wind howled around them. For a long moment, the only sound was the frantic breathing of the mules and the whimpering of the younger children. Jeb crawled up from the back of the wagon, covered in mud, his chest heaving. He looked at the children, huddled together on the bank. Safe. Then his eyes fell on Charlene. Her hands were scraped and bleeding, her dress torn, her hair plastered to her face by the sleet. She was shivering violently, but she was crawling over to check on Matthew and Samuel. "You caught him," Charlene said, her voice shaking as she looked at Samuel. "You saved your brother's life." Samuel, trembling, looked at Charlene, then down at his muddy hands. He didn't offer a snarky remark. He just nodded, pulling his little brother tighter against him. Jeb stepped forward and hauled Charlene to her feet with one massive hand. He didn't let go immediately. Through the thick leather of his gloves, Charlene could feel the trembling of his grip. "You ain't delicate, are you, town woman?" Jeb asked, his voice low, rough with adrenaline. "I have survived far worse than a broken wagon wheel, Mr. Russell," Charlene replied, her chin lifting defiantly despite her shivering. A ghost of a smirk touched the corner of Jeb's mouth. "It's Jeb. If we're gonna die on this mountain together, you might as well use my given name." They managed to unhitch the mules and load the barest essentials onto their backs. The rest of the journey was made on foot through the biting dark. When they finally reached the homestead, a massive, sturdy log cabin built securely into the side of the mountain. Charlene was nearly numb with cold. As they stepped inside, Jeb lit a lantern. The cabin was vast but steeped in shadows and neglect. Dust coated the heavy wooden furniture, and the hearth was stone cold. But it wasn't the mess that caught Charlene's attention. Above the massive stone fireplace hung a portrait of a stunningly beautiful woman with dark, piercing eyes. Her presence dominated the room. Charlene noticed Samuel staring at her as she looked at the painting. "That's our real Ma," Samuel said, his voice dropping to a harsh, resentful whisper, meant only for Charlene's ears, while Jeb was outside tending the mules. "She didn't just die of fever. He won't talk about it. But I know." Samuel took a step closer to Charlene, his young face hardened by a grief too heavy for his years. "He let her die up here. So don't think you're safe, Charlene. This mountain eats women alive." A chill that had nothing to do with the sleet outside settled into Charlene's bones. She looked from the hostile boy to the portrait of the dead woman, realizing that securing a husband was only the beginning. She had just traded a town that despised her for a mountain hiding a dark, deadly secret. Frost laced the inside of the heavy glass windows, tracing delicate fern-like patterns that did nothing to mask the bitter hostility of the Wyoming winter outside. Charlene Stewart's first month on Wolverine Ridge was a grueling baptism by ice and exhaustion. She learned quickly that survival in the Russell cabin required a calloused kind of grace. Her days began long before the sun crested the jagged peaks, starting with the shattering of ice in the wash basin and the hauling of heavy split logs to feed the insatiable stone hearth. Her hands, once soft from years of needlework, grew rough and blistered. Yet, she never uttered a single word of complaint. The town of Bitter Creek had convinced her she was a frail, useless thing, but the mountain was forging her into iron. Jeb watched her with silent, brooding intensity. He spent his days checking trap lines and reinforcing the barn against the heavy snowdrifts, but in the quiet evenings, his gaze would linger on Charlene. He noticed how she never raised her voice, even when Abigail spilled precious flour, or when Thomas tracked freezing mud across the freshly scrubbed floorboards. Instead, Charlene possessed an inexhaustible well of patience. She mended their ragged clothes, softening the harsh wool with gentle stitches, and slowly, the feral wildness of the younger children began to thaw. Little Matthew trailed after her like a shadow, clutching her skirts, and even the timid Lucy began to seek Charlene out, resting her head against Charlene's knee as she spun yarn by the fire. But Samuel remained a fortress of resentment. The 12-year-old boy was a ghost haunting his own home, constantly glaring at Charlene with an accusation she could not decipher. He remembered his mother, and he fiercely guarded her memory against the interloper. Late February brought a temporary break in the storms, though the snow remained piled high against the eaves. Jeb had taken the older boys, Samuel and Thomas, down to the lower timberline to scout for elk, leaving Charlene alone with the girls and little Matthew. Taking advantage of the quiet, Charlene decided to tackle the loft, a dusty, neglected space that had clearly not been touched since Sarah Russell's passing. Armed with a rag and a bucket of warm, soapy water, Charlene scrubbed the floorboards, coughing as years of soot gave way to raw pine. As she pushed a heavy wooden chest aside to clean beneath it, her rag caught on a splintered floorboard. The wood groaned and lifted slightly. Curiosity overcoming her exhaustion, Charlene pried the loose board up. Beneath it, nestled in the dark cavity between the joists, was a small, rusted tin box. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She wiped her hands on her apron and carefully opened the lid. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon and a small leather-bound diary. The handwriting was elegant, swooping gracefully across the parchment. It belonged to Sarah. Charlene knew she should put it back. A woman's private thoughts were sacred, but as her eyes caught the signature on one of the loose letters tucked into the diary, her blood ran entirely cold. Nathaniel Reed. Her ex-husband's bold, arrogant scrawl was unmistakable. Trembling, Charlene unfolded the heavy parchment. Sarah, the letter read, dated 3 years prior, just weeks before Sarah's death. Your husband's stubbornness will be the ruin of your family. The loan is coming due, and I know he does not have the gold. The deed to Wolverine Ridge will be mine. However, as I have mentioned, a woman of your beauty and refinement does not belong freezing on a rock. Bring me the silver claim you found. Do this, and I will tear up the promissory note. Fail me, and I will have the sheriff evict your children into the snow. Do not tell that brute of a husband. He is too proud to save you. Charlene gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. Nathaniel had been blackmailing Jeb's wife. He wasn't just a cruel husband to Charlene. He was a ruthless predator stealing land claims across the territory, using fraudulent loans to trap desperate homesteaders. Wolverine Ridge sat on a vein of silver, and Nathaniel had known it. Charlene opened Sarah's diary, flipping to the final entry. The winter fever has passed, but I am still weak. Jeb refuses to ask for help, but he doesn't know about the loan. He doesn't know Reed is coming to take our home. I found the silver vein Reed wants. I must go down the mountain tonight while Jeb sleeps. I will give Reed the silver to pay the debt. If Jeb finds out, he will kill Reed, and they will hang my husband. I must save my family. Tears blurred Charlene's vision. Sarah hadn't died of neglect. She had sacrificed herself, walking into a brutal blizzard to protect her husband from his own pride and to save her children's home. What are you doing? Charlene jumped, dropping the tin box. Jeb stood at the top of the loft ladder. His massive frame seemed to block out the scarce winter light. His chest heaved, his eyes wide and wild as he stared at the scattered letters on the floor. Jeb, I was cleaning, I swear, I just. Charlene scrambled to gather the papers, but Jeb was faster. He crossed the loft in 2 strides, falling to his knees and snatching the leather diary from her hands. For a terrifying moment, Charlene thought he might strike her. His face contorted with a grief so raw and violent, it was agonizing to witness. But instead of rage, a broken, tearing sob ripped from the mountain man's throat. He clutched the diary to his chest, burying his face in his hands as his broad shoulders shook. Charlene didn't hesitate. She crawled across the dusty floor and wrapped her arms around his shaking frame. She pulled his head down to her shoulder, holding him just as tightly as she had held his toddler in the mercantile. "I know," Charlene whispered fiercely into his hair. "I read it, Jeb. I know why she went out into the storm." Jeb pulled back, his piercing blue eyes swimming with unshed tears. "You don't understand. I woke up and found her gone. I tracked her through the snow, but the blizzard was too thick. I found her 2 days later. She had fallen into a drift near the ravine. The cold, it took her." He swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "When I brought her body back, Samuel demanded to know why she left. He was only 9. How could I tell him his mother died because I was too blind to see we were in debt? How could I tell him she died to stop me from hanging? So, I took the blame. I told the boy we had a fight, and I locked her out. I let him hate me, Charlene, because a boy needs his mother to be an angel. He can't know she was terrified." Charlene stared at him, utterly awestruck by the depth of his sacrifice. Jeb Russell was not a monster who let his wife die. He was a man who bore the crushing weight of his son's hatred to protect his dead wife's honor. "You are a good man, John Russell," Charlene said softly, reaching up to wipe a stray tear from his weathered cheek. "But you cannot carry this alone anymore, and you certainly cannot let Nathaniel Reed get away with what he did." Jeb's hand came up, his rough fingers gently tracing her jawline. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to Charlene's heart. For weeks they had shared a home, but in this dusty loft, surrounded by ghosts, they finally truly saw one another. "I brought you up here to work," Jeb murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. "I thought my heart was dead in the ground. But watching how you love my children when the world told you that you were empty. Charlene, you are the most complete woman I have ever known." He leaned in, and their lips met. The kiss tasted of salt and sorrow, but underneath it burned a fierce, undeniable fire. It was not the tepid, dutiful affection Charlene had known in her first marriage. This was raw, desperate, and entirely consuming. Jeb's massive hands pulled her flush against his chest, claiming her not as a housekeeper, but as his wife. The spring thaw arrived with a violent rushing of water down the mountain slopes. The snowbanks receded, revealing the vibrant, stubborn green of alpine grass. With the clear roads came the danger Charlene had been dreading since her discovery in the loft. It was mid-April, when the barking of their hounds broke the peaceful morning. Charlene stepped onto the porch, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. Jeb emerged from the barn, an axe gripped loosely in his right hand. Riding up the muddy trail was Nathaniel Reed, flanked by 3 men in heavy dusters. The men wore the brass stars of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, hired guns legally sanctioned to enforce the will of rich men. Nathaniel reined his polished black gelding to a halt in the yard, his eyes sweeping over the property with greedy satisfaction. He paused when he saw Charlene on the porch, a sneer curling his lip. Well, well, if it isn't my Baron Castoff," Nathaniel mocked loudly, ensuring the armed men heard him. "Still playing house in the dirt, Charlene. I see you survived the winter. Pity." Jeb stepped between the horses and the cabin, his presence towering. "Get off my land, Reed." Nathaniel pulled a crisp, folded document from his coat. "It isn't your land anymore, Russell. This here is a foreclosure deed, signed by the circuit judge in Cheyenne. Your wife took out a loan against this property 3 years ago. It's long past due. I'm here to collect the deed, or the gold." The 3 Pinkertons rested their hands on the grips of their revolvers. Jeb's knuckles turned white on his axe handle. He was outnumbered, and Nathaniel knew it. "Pack your brats and get off my mountain," Nathaniel demanded, "or we'll burn the cabin down with you inside." "You aren't taking this farm," a voice rang out, clear and steady. All eyes turned to the porch. Charlene stood there, but she was no longer holding a kitchen towel. In her hands, pressed firmly against her shoulder, was Jeb's heavy Winchester repeating rifle. She had the hammer cocked, and the barrel was pointed directly at Nathaniel Reed's chest. Nathaniel laughed, though it sounded nervous. "Put the gun down, Charlene. You don't have the stomach to shoot a man." "You're right, Nathaniel," Charlene said, her voice dripping with venom, "but I do have the stomach to shoot a snake." She didn't lower the rifle, but with her left hand, she tossed a small leather ledger onto the muddy ground at Nathaniel's horse's hooves. "That is Sarah Russell's diary," Charlene announced, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. "And inside it are 3 letters written by you, Nathaniel. Letters detailing how you forged the original loan documents, how you extorted a desperate woman, and how you threatened a federal land claim illegally." Nathaniel's face drained of color. "I already sent copies of those letters down to the federal marshal in Laramie with the supply wagon last week," Charlene lied smoothly, her eyes completely unflinching. "If you try to take this land, or if anything happens to this family, the marshal will have the proof he needs to hang you for fraud and extortion." The Pinkertons exchanged uneasy glances. They were hired to evict squatters, not to get tangled in federal fraud investigations. One of the men slowly took his hand off his gun. Nathaniel's horse sidestepped as he glared at Charlene. "You're lying. You're a pathetic, empty woman trying to play a hero." "She ain't empty." The voice came from beside the cabin. Samuel stepped into the light. The 12-year-old boy was holding his father's smaller varmint rifle, aiming it squarely at the Pinkertons. Beside him, Thomas stood holding a heavy iron pitchfork. Samuel looked at Nathaniel with pure, unadulterated hatred. Then the boy took a step toward the porch, placing himself directly between Nathaniel and Charlene. "You heard my mother," Samuel said, his voice cracking slightly but holding a terrifying resolve. "Get off our land." The word mother hung in the air, heavier than the threat of gunfire. Charlene felt a tear slip down her cheek, her heart expanding so rapidly she thought it might burst from her chest. Samuel had forgiven his father, having finally been told the truth the night before, and now he had accepted her. Nathaniel looked at the guns, looked at the defiant family, and realized he had lost. His reputation in Bitter Creek relied on his perceived legality. If the marshal came investigating, his entire banking empire would crumble. "This isn't over," Nathaniel spat, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his fear. He violently yanked his horse's reins, turning the animal around. "Let's go." The Pinkertons eagerly followed, spurring their horses down the treacherous trail, desperate to put distance between themselves and the heavily armed, fiercely protective mountain family. Silence descended on Wolverine Ridge, save for the whisper of the wind through the pines. Charlene carefully uncocked the Winchester, her hands shaking as the adrenaline receded. She leaned the rifle against the porch rail and slid down against the wooden post, suddenly feeling very weak in the knees. Jeb dropped his axe and ran to her, sweeping her up into his massive arms. He spun her around, burying his face in her neck. "You magnificent crazy woman," Jeb laughed, a sound so joyful and free it seemed to echo for miles. "Copies to the marshal in Laramie?" Charlene smiled against his shoulder, gasping for breath. "A bluff, but a necessary one." Samuel walked up onto the porch, lowering his own rifle. He looked at Charlene, his dark eyes finally stripped of their anger. He reached out and awkwardly patted her arm. "You did good, Ma." Charlene reached out, pulling the stubborn boy into her embrace. He stiffened for a fraction of a second before melting into her, wrapping his arms around her waist. The cabin door opened, and the other children spilled out, sensing the danger had passed. Matthew barreled into Charlene's legs, babbling happily, while Lucy and Thomas crowded around, wrapping their arms around whoever they could reach. Jeb stood back for a moment, watching the chaotic, beautiful tangle of his family. He looked at Charlene, surrounded by the children who adored her, the children she had fought a ruthless man and a brutal mountain to protect. The town of Bitter Creek had called her barren. They had cast her out because she could not give birth to a child. But as Charlene looked up, meeting Jeb's loving, fiercely devoted gaze over the heads of their children, she knew the truth. Biology was only a small part of motherhood. She had not given these children life. They had given her hers. Did Charlene prove that true motherhood is born in the heart, not just the blood? Hit that like button if you cheered for Charlene and Samuel's incredible standoff. Share this video with someone who loves a story of ultimate redemption and Wild West justice. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, dramatic tales of love and survival. What was your favorite moment of Charlene's revenge? Tell us in the comments.
Hi, my name is Val Ellery, the owner and manager of Mountain Val Ellery. After watching the video, She Can't Give Children, they said, until a lonely mountain man with 5 kids chose her, I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me was the reminder that a person's worth can't be reduced to what others expect from them. Family can grow through patience, care, and the choice to show up for one another in ways that truly matter. Would you have looked beyond what everyone else was saying? And what do you think really makes someone part of a family? Maybe this story can remind us to judge people less quickly and value the love and care they bring. If it meant something to you, share your thoughts below and feel free to like or subscribe.